Good morning, BookTube. It's Tony here from Lockster Reads. This is going to be mainly a January, what I read in January update. So let's crack on. I read Half Past Human by T.J. Bass. This is a science fiction novel published in 1971. It's part of my read one book from each year of my life. 1971 is the year I was born. It's quite an interesting read. It's basically set in a Earth's future where humans have sort of been selectively bred or have bred into a sort of four-toed, easily managed, quite tightly sort of controlled social group. The world is basically massively overpopulated, but there are some surviving five-toed mutations out there, and it's the story of what happens at that society, a sort of rebellion by the five-toed people. It's part of a duology. The second book is Godwell, which I will read sooner or later. I really enjoyed it. The writing is great. The world building is great. It reminded me a bit of a couple of other science fiction books I've read, but basically well worth reading. It's available in the SF Masterworks on Kindle and or as a hard copy, I assume, if that's still available. Then I read The Stranger by Albert Camus. That's a reread. I read it as part of a project of reading a book from each country, but then I realised there's some argument about whether Albert Camus counts as French or Algerian. The Stranger is basically the story of a French Algerian man who commits an act of murder. He kills an Arab, and importantly, the Arab is never given a name, which will be important with the next book. It's a brilliantly written book, and I would recommend reading it. It's very short, so it's a relatively straightforward read, but there's a lot in it, and there's a lot to think about having read it. So the follow-up book that I read was called The Meursault Investigation by Kamel, Daoud, translated by John Cullen. That's an Algerian author's response to The Stranger, told from the point of view of the brother of the victim of the Frenchman in The Stranger. So the nameless Arab is given a name and given a life, and his story is told. It's a strong book. I really recommend it. I recommend you read both books. Basically, read The Stranger and then read The Meursault Investigation. I think the combination of the two makes for an interesting read. I would recommend, do it as a double bill. They're both relatively short books. They're both very good reads. It's interesting how they're structured in similar ways. But yeah, I really recommend. I recommend both of those. I read the Lost Babes, Manchester United and the Forgotten Victims of Munich by Jeff Connor. That's a non-fiction book about football. It's quite a scathing attack on how Manchester United have dealt with the families of those who died at Munich over the years, whilst also managing to tell the stories of those people, both the footballers and their families. I really recommend it. It's a sort of good anti-football propaganda book. Football, due to the money involved and due to the way it influences people, has a very propagandistic view of its own history, and occasionally it's good for somebody to pop up and say, well, actually, all that money from a game, and when people are in need, you have done very little to help them. Now, Connor makes a good. Well, somebody in the book makes a good point that the response in the 50s is what you probably would have expected from the 50s. Although some of the sort of the swiftness in which like players' families were booted out of their houses, their club houses after their husbands had died, it does seem quite harsh even for the time. But the main point that the book raises is in the aftermath, in the long years afterwards, when Manchester United has made billions of pounds, why it took so long for them to do anything for the families of the players that died at Munich. It's a good book. I recommend it. I read John Williams's Augustus. That might be that, and a book I'm going to mention later might be my favourite books I've read this month. Augustus is the story of Augustus, the Roman emperor. It's told mainly through sort of letters and reports, and the first 2/3 of it is other people talking about Augustus. You never hear from Augustus himself. It's his friends, his family, his enemies, and then the final bit is Augustus himself, sort of retelling the stories that have been told in the first 2/3 from his point of view. The best thing about this book, it's a brilliant book. I really recommend you read it. I know John Williams is more famous for Stoner, but and I've never read Stoner, so this made me want to. But Augustus is definitely worth reading. The thing I liked about it above all is the way he handles the women in the story. There's a tendency both from history and fiction to paint Julia, his daughter, for example, as some kind of sex crazed lunatic, and his wife as a poor, evil, poisoning, devious woman, and both of those women are given voice, are not portrayed by that in this book. Julia actually gets a lot to say herself, and gets to tell her side of the story, and that makes a refreshing change. I love I Claudius, but the way that the women in that are portrayed is the traditional Roman historical version of events, which may or may not be true. But it's nice to have for Roman women to have a voice that isn't just, oh, she was a sex crazed lunatic or evil poisoner, and she was the wife, she was Macbeth's wife, that kind of thing. And then the rest of the books I read this month are all from the International Booker Prize is announced. The long list is announced in February, and there's a Goodreads list of what people put up as potential books for that list. Now, I actually, having looked at the list, I think there's a number of books on there that will never make an International Booker list, just because of the type of book they are. But I've started reading some of those just to try and get a bit ahead of the curve. So I read The Night of the Baba Yaga by Akira Otani, translated by Sam Bett. That's a Japanese novel about a woman who is forced to become a bodyguard for the daughter of a Yakuza gang leader. It's an really fun story. I don't think it will make the International Booker Prize long list, just because of the genre it fits, for want of a better word. Maybe I'm being unfair on the International Booker Prize, but it's worth a read, because there is stuff in it, not just the sort of ultra violence, but on the role of women in Japan, how lives are changed by violence, and how some groups within society will never let the violence go, and therefore the violence never stops, even when it becomes self-defeating. Then I read Clean by Alia, Trabucco, Zoran, translated by Sophie Hughes. I don't have much to say about that because I didn't really enjoy it. It's not because it's a bad book. I think it's a fine book, but I think it wasn't for me. Sometimes you get that with a book. You have nothing. You can't really explain why you didn't like it. You can't really explain why you did like it. It just didn't really do it for me. Although I have friends who've read it who thought it was excellent. So on this one, I say take a dip. It's worth a dip because, as I said, it's a fine book. I just didn't enjoy the subject matter or the way the book went. I wish I'd made more notes on this one. I think it's because I sped through this one a bit, and I wish I'd read more notes to explain it. Then I read Reservoir Bitches by Dahlia de la Cerdas, translated by Julia Sanches and Heather Cleary. That's a Mexican short story collection that tells the stories of a number of women in Mexico and the horrific way women in Mexico are treated. Some of the short stories connect together. Some of them are sort of what we call normal short stories, and some of them have a supernatural element. It's brilliant. I really enjoyed this. I get the feeling as well, particularly from the final story, that Dahlia de la Cerdas that there's a real personal element to at least one of these stories, maybe more than one of them. But I would really recommend. I'm not a massive reader of short story collections, but this I really enjoyed this. Julia Sanchez does a lot of translation of Eve Balthazar's stuff, I think, if I remember rightly. And then finally, I read Woodworm by Layla Martinez, translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott. That was probably that Reservoir Bitches and Augustus are probably the top 3 books I read this month. Woodworm is a dark story of a mother and a grandmother and her granddaughter, a scary house in Spain. It's again a bit like Reservoir Bitches. There's sort of stuff really in there about women, how women's lives have been impacted by violence and by society, but also there's some stuff in there about Spain's history, about the Spanish Civil War, the consequences of the Spanish Civil War. It's done reasonably subtly, but it's all part of that book. It's a dark book. I could see how it was going to end, but it was still quite. That didn't affect the enjoyment of the book as a whole. So in terms of quality, I don't think there's any. The only one I didn't enjoy was Clean, and that was more just, as I said, that's more me than. Oh, and I DNF'd a South Korean book called The New Jelly Park Massacre. I can't remember, but I DNF'd that. I don't want to talk about. One thing I don't want to do on this channel is talk about DNFs because it's unfair on the writers, because sometimes unless I think the writer has done something particularly foul and egregious, I don't think it's fair to hammer a book that you didn't read. It just wasn't for me, and it might well be for you. More the genre, the sort of type of story it was, than the actual writing. I won't go on about that. I'm about to go on about it for ages, and I shouldn't really, as I said. So that's it for my January reading. I will be reading more. There are 2 sort of prize long lists. Well, I will be reading more. I vowed that I wasn't going to read the International Booker long list last year because both of that, the last couple of years of both the International Booker and the Booker Prize have been slightly disappointing to me. And I've jokingly said before that I think I don't like contemporary fiction, but that's probably unfair on contemporary fiction. Booker Prize lists are not the be-all and end-all of contemporary fiction. And really the thing should be to read more contemporary fiction before the long lists are announced, because I think both the International Booker and the Booker Prize have a type of book that they like. It does vary sometimes from year to year, but you can there's a type, and that affects what you read in the long list and the short list, which skews your opinion of the prizes in general. The fact that Prophet Song won not last year but the year before is, and it's such not a very good book, is was one thing. Orbital was fine. I think it was overrated. But it's a reason I enjoyed it more than a lot of the people I know who read it, or less than other people. I like the idea of Orbital. I would have voted for hell myself, but even then, a lot of people would have disagree with me. But I'm going to try and read some more International Booker sort of prizes potential from the long list, and then the long list, depending on what I've read and what I haven't read. And the British Science Fiction Association, the BSAFA long lists have come out. The novel list I have put onto a spreadsheet, and I will try and read some of those before they get to the announcement of the prize. There are a few of them on Libby. I own a couple of them. I do have a thing about science fiction and fantasy book prizes, in that I think there should be a separate category for books that are not but part one of a series. Because if you nominate, say, volume 3 of a series, and I've not read volumes 1 and 2, to read volume 3, I need to read 1, 2, and 3. It's a weird thing to complain about, I know, but it almost feels to me that there should be a category which is best novel series, best novel sort of later books in the series, and best novel standalone or something. This is a rambling video. I'm sorry about this. So the plan for February, I have 11 books on my currently reading list on Goodreads. That's because there's a number of big books on there that are long-term projects. 2 of which are books I started and then didn't carry on with for various reasons. Nothing to do with the fact I wasn't enjoying them. Just I got distracted. I will talk about my February TBR shortly, in a different video, perhaps before this one becomes 4 hours long. I'm really sorry about how rambling this video is. I really should get better at planning them and organising them, but I kind of was in the mood to do it this morning, and so I've done it. So there you go. That was my January reading. I would really recommend Woodworm by Layla Martinez, Reservoir Bitches by Dahlia de Cerdas, Augustus by John Williams, a double bill of The Stranger by Camus, and the Meursault Investigation by Kamel Daoud. Those would be my real recommendations of recommendations. And I will read Godwell by TJ Bass as a follow-up to Half Past Human. And that's it. Have a good day, and I will speak to you soon, hopefully in a more coordinated and organised way.